All right, so we're going to start talking about the road to the American Revolution. This is part one. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through about 15 steps from how we went from happy, satisfied colonists to rebels willing to kill fellow countrymen to be free of England. So how did that happen? It is actually quite an odd story. And I think we Americans, we've talked about the founding fathers our whole lives and the revolution to the point that we practically take it for granted. The other thing about the revolution I find is that it's not something that people really think much about. There's not an emotional attachment to the revolution in the way that people are emotionally attached, for instance, to the Civil War, especially in the South. The Civil War, we watch movies about it, we read novels about it, we reenact it, we argue over statues about it. The Revolution, it's a little bit different up north because most of it happened up north. But even there, there's a different relationship to it. And sometimes I think it's because the period when it took place is so different from today. And I think part of it is our relationship to it is paintings. There's no photographs. But usually when we talk about the founding fathers, we present them almost as though they're these perfect people. People love to say, well, the founding fathers didn't believe that, or the founding fathers, as though, first off, they're all the same. When it turns out all these guys couldn't stand each other. They were arguing with each other. Not only that, but not just the founding fathers, but the 3 million people living in the colonies all had different reasons for the revolution. As John Adams once wrote in a letter, only about a third of the colonists were actually for revolution. A good third were absolutely against a revolution. They were loyalists. And again, probably about a third didn't really have a feeling one way or the other. So we tend to lump all these people together as the colonists or the founding fathers. And then we give them this sense that, again, they're perfect and they knew what they were doing. And one thing to keep in mind as we go through this period is they had no clue what they were doing. Just like you don't know what you're doing tomorrow or next week, they had no idea what was coming. And again, remember, in 1763, nobody knows there's going to be a revolution. And even when the revolution begins, nobody knows what's on the other side of it. There wasn't some ultimate plan that we're going to create this wonderful country and we're going to create a democracy. They were literally making it up as they went. And sometimes that aspect of history, we have to try to recapture sometimes. Anyway, I didn't mean to have that long of an introduction. One thing we do need to do before we go much further, though, is for the online class, I don't do everything I do in the face-to-face class because you guys do discussions, you do a little more reading than I do in the face-to-face. And one lecture that we didn't really do is talking about English colonies and such. And I'm not going to, you read about it. We're not going to go into that. But there's a little bit that I go into when I talk about English colonies that I do think is important to go into now. So, and that is to talk a little bit about, who are the English and what's this all about? So very quickly, of course, we're talking about what we sometimes call Great Britain. And of course, Britain is the island, and the island is comprised of 3 countries, Scotland, England, and Wales. And then, of course, Ireland is a separate island to the west. So for this lecture, really, we're just talking about England, even though Scotland's involved and all that, but we're really specifically talking about England. So who are the English? And again, this is something I normally go into a little bit earlier, but I mean, obviously, English culture is the core culture of the US. And I know that in itself might be a little controversial because a lot of people in our country, including a lot of people in this class, probably don't have English background. You may be from West Africa, you may be from Germany, your ancestry may be from France or Ireland or Scotland or Mexico or Native America, right? But it is, culturally speaking, it is still the core culture. I mean, it's the language we're speaking right now. Our form of government is an English form of government. Uh, Most of our laws are really based on English laws. Our culture is still very English, even though we meld all these other cultures in there as well. If you ever get a chance to go to Britain, England, or Scotland, you will, it's obviously different, but you will feel a similarity to it. Even if, again, even if your background is not actually English. So who are the English? And of course, the English, just like us, English are a melding of a lot of different peoples. You had the original people, the Britons, if you will, the original inhabitants of England, who actually go back about the same time as Paleo-Indians. About 10,000 years ago is the earliest permanent peoples in what we now call England. And those people eventually, they were for a while ruled by the Romans. Romans do come in for about 400 years. And of course, Roman people are people from what is today Italy and Spain, even Northern African. So today, if you look at DNA studies of English, you do see little traces of Irish, Spanish, Greek, and even African. But generally speaking, they're still the Britons. And then later you get these Angles and Saxons, which are Germanic tribes. And in fact, they bring the language with them. English is a Germanic language. And eventually it becomes known, this island becomes known as Angleland, England, as in the Angles. And then finally in 1066, you get French invaders, the Normans. They basically become the royalty. And actually for several centuries, royalty in England actually spoke French. The common people spoke English, but the royalty spoke French. However, after 1066, we don't really get another invasion of England. So by the 1600s, and by the time of this lecture, the 1700s, even though you have sort of these original inhabitants, and then you have for a while the Romans, and again these Germanic tribes and these French groups, by the 16 and 1700s, there is this unified English culture. And unlike, to me, much of the rest of Europe, England does have kind of a unique identity. And part of that's also because they're an island. They really do think of themselves as uniquely English, much more so than I think the French or the Spanish or Germanic peoples or Italian peoples, back then, they didn't really have a national identity. England pretty much did. It was a real ethnicity. So in 1763, when we really begin this lecture, what was England like? And by virtue, to some degree, what was the colonies like? So not only were English Christian, I mean, yes, we do have some Jewish populations and some Catholic populations. They were Christian, but specifically Protestant. Once you get past the Protestant Reformation, England is fully a Protestant country. And then later that kind of plays a role because there's going to be a lot of, in the US, anti-Catholic feelings, for instance, in addition to anti-Jewish feelings. That is really key. Deferential. We can definitely describe English society as a deferential society. All of Europe has that a bit back then, but England really does take it to another degree. To show deference to somebody is basically to acknowledge that somebody is your better, or if somebody shows deference to you, they're acknowledging that you are better than them. I mean, in a way, we're talking about a class system here, but something a little more ingrained than this. And I think this is really key to understanding why the founding fathers, why what they're doing is actually quite revolutionary. Because again, the key phrase that we always go back to is, in the Declaration of Independence, is this idea of all men are created equal. I mean, that is a revolutionary statement if you're coming from a deferential society that definitely believes that there is strata of people. In other words, people at the top and the people in the middle and people at the bottom. And I usually talk about this before colonization even starts. So this explains to some degree why the English, have certain feelings when it comes to Native Americans or later Africans, when, these ideas of deference start to kind of meld into racial ideas, which is not our purpose in this lecture, but you know, this has a huge thing. We still see this in British society. I mean, even as, you know, as some of you know, I direct a Scotland program. And some of you are interested, you know, talk to me. I know May's a long time off, and I'm recording this in August, or excuse me, September of 2020. So right now we're worried about COVID, but hopefully that'll go away. So if you're interested, let me know. Anyway, Scotland has this too, but not quite as much as England. But if you get to go to England or Scotland, even in 2020, you will still get a sense of this, if you will, leftover deference ideas. For instance, accents. I mean, in America, accents do have some meaning. You know, for instance, if you watch a Hollywood movie and somebody talks in a Southern accent, it's almost like the signal they're dumb or they're racist, right? So we have, you know, we do base judgments on accents here, but not as much as they do in Britain. Even as late as, again, today, having a certain type of accent can sometimes keep you from getting certain jobs. In London newspapers, you can still find advertisements for classes that you can take to lose your working class accent. You know, in America, Southern accents are quote unquote the dumb accent. In English society, it's Northern English accents. That's considered, that's their South in a way. That's the poor area. That's considered the more quote unquote backward area. So if you're coming to London, the capital, to get a job, and you have a very strong North English accent, it could keep you from getting a job. One of the things that you learn unofficially when you go to university is a university accent. Let me give you a couple other strange things in English society. How you drink your tea denotes your class. For instance, if you drink tea with a lot of sugar, that's low class. If you drink it with a little bit of sugar, that's upper class. If you put your milk in first, then your tea, upper class. If you put your tea in, then your milk, lower class. The way you eat your peas, they eat peas almost every meal, it seems like. If you kind of scoop them up with a spoon like we would, that's working class. But if you take your fork and mash the peas and then eat them, that's upper class. So everything you do, the way you speak, the way you dress, the way you drink tea, the way you eat peas, everything screams your class. And again, and that goes back to deference. And in some way, I think in America, race kind of comes first for a lot of people. You know, people see what race you are, then they make judgments. There, it's class. So anyway, I'll back off. But I do want you to have a strong sense of this idea of deference and how much it plays a role. English civil rights, I'm going to go into a little detail in this in a moment, but at the core value, or I mean, excuse me, at the core level, this is something kind of unique to England. We don't really see this quite as much in other European countries, but a civil right is the right that you have as a citizen of a country. I think in America, people immediately, when they hear civil rights, go right to race because we think of the civil rights movement. But civil rights are simply to mean the rights that you have as a citizen of a country. We have American civil rights. We also talk about human rights, which, by the way, these ideas like human rights kind of come partly out of the American Revolution. But in England, going all the way back to the 1200s, they had some sense that because you're English, you automatically have certain rights. And let me give you an example of a couple of these, because they're going to come back as we get into the revolution. One of these rights is the idea that, I mean, it's often described as your home is your castle. I mean, this is sort of an English idea. So no one can just come into your house without your permission. Even the king is limited in that. That idea is going to come up in the American Revolution. Another core English civil right is the right of you cannot be imprisoned unless you have a trial by a jury of your equals. And again, this is something else that's going to come up during the American Revolution. So this is something that's uniquely English. And of course, we Americans took that from the English, because obviously the colonists were English before they became American. And that seems like a dumb thing to say, but I think people do forget that. You know, so this is why England is the core culture here, right? Anyway, so another thing to understand the English and it's really even going back again before the colonization period begins, it's this idea of English superiority. I think every culture has a bit of this. The England has it pretty strongly. And I love England. Again, I go to Scotland a lot. I also go to England a lot. I love England. But I will say, having spent a lot of time in Scotland and then going down to England, they're not snobby, they're not snooty, but you can feel it. There is a difference. I mean, it's still alive today. But back in the 16 and 1700s, English very much believed that not only they were equal to other countries, but they were better. And again, if you look at English history, we're going to go into a little bit of it today. I mean, the island of Britain, you know, again, Scotland, England, Wales, England has always been the dominant power there. You know, even today, now that they're all united, the capital of England is also the capital of the United Kingdom. They controlled Scotland to a large degree. They controlled Wales. Later, they control Ireland, not the other way around. Their religion, you know, since the Protestant Reformation, is the Church of England. There is no, you know, they're not worried about any other churches. They have their own church, which is one of the reasons why when they do colonize, unlike, say, the Spanish, there's not really a strong system of missionizing, you know, because again, they have their own church. And again, in the 1600s, they are becoming a dominant power. They have the, you know, a great navy. 1588, they defeat the Spanish in a major battle. By 1763, they've defeated both France and Spain. France was the dominant power in Europe at that point, and England beats them in a major war. And so there is this strong sense of they are superior. And the colonists, I think, have this. And I think to some degree, this is going to drive a little bit of the revolution. I also think this explains us, Americans. We Americans really like ourselves. And I think we have a lot to be proud of. I mean, I'm an American. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it is interesting. And this is something I think if you travel, you will notice that most countries, people don't fly their own flags. That's kind of a uniquely American thing. We love to wear t-shirts with the American flag on it. We love to tell everybody we're #1. We have bumper stickers. I mean, it is kind of an odd thing that we love to do that. And guess what? We get that from the English. This is something that's a leftover from the English. So again, this is a modern day map, but real quick about terminology. I try to be specific, but again, you have two basic islands here on the right, the island of Britain, Scotland at the top, England's most of it, and then over to the left, a little bit of it is Wales, and then that other island is, of course, the island of Ireland. So if you're talking about Scottish, obviously somebody from Scotland, English, somebody from England, Irish, Welsh. But when you talk about British, you're talking about anything or anyone from the island of Britain. And then, of course, all of this is the United Kingdom. And yes, anybody's being picky. I know Ireland is actually two, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But I wasn't going to get that detail. So I'll try to be very specific. If I mean English, I'll say English. If I mean British, but generally speaking, I'll be talking about English today. Okay, so the road to revolution. It took me a long time to find an image of George Washington on a road. Anyway, I'm going to stay on this slide for a little while. So one thing, let me start out with saying the American Revolution is weird. Now, we're not used to hearing that because it's our revolution and we think, well, this is the way it is. But it is weird. Historians will tell you that it doesn't fit the pattern of most revolutions. Number one, because revolutions almost never work. If you look at the histories of revolutions, they almost always fail, or they turn into something they weren't supposed to be. The classic example is the French Revolution, which was directly inspired by ours. 1789, we'll get into this a little bit later, but they took our ideals and actually made them better at first, or at least they seemed to. But within a couple of years, it devolved into massive chaos and violence, and then ultimately ended up with a dictator, an emperor, Napoleon. But if you look at the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the various revolutions in the 1830s and 1840s, the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, they all ended badly. And again, we got really, really lucky. And in fact, as we'll see, as we get past the revolution, especially in the 1790s, we barely held on. And obviously, we went through this horrible civil war that we'll get into at the end of the semester. And again, it is amazing that we're still together. So number one, it is weird because it was successful. Two, usually revolutions happen when people are literally at their wits' end. If you look at like the French Revolution, people were literally being taxed to death. It's when people are starving, when they feel completely oppressed. That's when revolutions happen. That's not what was going on in the colonies. I'll come back to this a couple of times today, but the colonists actually had it really good. There really wasn't oppression here at all. Even when England starts to screw up later, they do screw up. In the bigger picture, it is still surprising looking back today and going, why did they rebel? And I know that usually, if we're face to face, I'll ask you, why do we rebel? Why did there a revolution? And the typical answer is taxation without representation. But again, if you really stop and think about it, do you really think there are soldiers on the battlefield screaming, taxation without representation, bastards? It wasn't really about the taxes. It was about something else, something deeper. The taxes is what we always talk about because it's easy. And some people say, well, it's not about taxes. It's about their role in government. They wanted a more of a say in government. Yes, that's true. But again, as you'll see in a moment, that's kind of weird because most people in England didn't have a say in the government. And of course, I'm going to ask you this more than once. Well, why didn't the people of England rebel? Why was it the colonists that rebelled? Because it turns out people in England had it so much worse than the people in the colonies. And again, that's something we really do need to talk about. Why did they rebel? And why did Spanish not rebel? Why did the French colonists not rebel? The Portuguese colonists, the Dutch colonists, the Russian colonists, why didn't they rebel? Why is it the British colonists in America? Why did they rebel and the other guys didn't? And that's really kind of my goal in this first part, is to really kind of explain some of the background. But before I get to that, I guess I need to say, well, what's ultimately my argument as to why they rebelled? We're going to go through all the steps, and most of these steps you probably remember from high school: the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts and the Boston Tea Party and all of that. But I still think there's something that needs to be explained here, because it is weird. The way I tend to explain this is it is like a marriage. I know some historians don't like to use this analogy, but this is an analogy I like to use. Sorry, sorry. I know the worst sound is the professor swallowing on mic, so I'll try not to drink too much on mic. Okay, so here's the analogy I like to use. So imagine you have a married couple, and I'm going to be very traditional here just to keep it simple. So you have a husband and wife, and the wife stays at home. Nobody does that anymore, but the wife stays at home. She's the caretaker, and the husband goes, let's pretend it's the 50s, and the husband goes off to work, right? And they've been married for 20 years, and now they're middle age, and the husband every day, he's at work by 9 a.m. and he leaves work by 5 p.m. It's like clockwork. And if he's going to be a little bit late, he's always going to call ahead and say, I'm going to be a little bit late so she can have dinner ready. Again, I know nobody does this anymore. All right, so that's been the pattern. And then after about 20 years or so, suddenly the husband sometimes comes home 6:30 now. Instead of 5:30, it's 6:30, maybe 7:30. Sometimes even as late as 9 o'clock. He doesn't always call ahead. Now, if we were face to face, I'd ask you guys, why do you think this is? And already, usually students are already smiling and giggling. And then finally somebody will say, oh, he's cheating on her, man. He's got somebody on the side. And almost everybody agrees. And then you ask why. And by the way, since I made this couple up, they don't exist. I'm telling you right now, he's not cheating on his wife. And it's so funny because sometimes students say, I don't care, he's still cheating. Even though you made him up, he's still cheating. In other words, we're suspicious. Why are we suspicious? And the short answer is there's a change in the pattern. Obviously, there's a communication issue here. Obviously, he should have spoke to his wife and explained it to her. which we'll see that with the colonies in England. There is a communication issue there. But ultimately, it's about a pattern. We are pattern-seeking animals. That's how we read. That's why music works for us. You know, pattern of sounds. We learn through patterns. Without patterns, we can't function as a society, right? So once we get used to a pattern, if the pattern suddenly changes, our reaction is almost always negative. Why is that different? I'm very new technologies. People get really weird about them. New neighbors, people get weird about them. We don't like change of patterns, especially if they're not communicated well. And once there's suspicion in any kind of relationship, especially a marriage, it's usually game over. It may take many years, but once you begin to suspect that your significant other is cheating on you, you almost never lose that. It really is a major problem, right? So we see this with the colonies. We see one pattern of relationship between the colonies and England. Basically, England, for about 50 years, England sort of, and I'm going to put it in quotes but England ignored the colonies. And the reason I put it in quotes is it's not like they didn't pay attention at all, but a very loose governance of the colonies. Colonies were able to kind of do their own thing. And then after 1763, King George III is on the throne, and he's quite different, and he starts to pay attention to the colonies a lot more. And there's a change in the pattern, and the colonies become very suspicious. Related to this, and again, still using this analogy of a marriage, sometimes what can happen in a relationship is either you begin to grow apart. Because let me tell you, you're not the same person at 18 that you will be at 48. I mean, you are different. Your spouse will be different. And sometimes you grow apart. Sometimes you grow closer together. And in fact, a real relationship, by the way, looks like this. It is not always like that. I mean, that's just a reality. And so sometimes you grow so far apart that you eventually split up. And again, the colonies had a lot of freedom for a long time. And when they began to lose, even if it was just a little bit, but once they started losing that freedom, they didn't like it. And they had really grown apart. England and the colonies had really been growing apart for a long time. Keep in mind, most of these colonists had never been to Britain at all. Scotland, Ireland, Wales, doesn't matter. They'd never been there. Most of their parents were born in the colonies. Many of their grandparents were born in the colonies. It'd be like if our government was on the moon, but we've never been to the moon. After a while, you don't know what it's like there anymore. And that's practically what it would be like to live in the colony of Georgia. England, it might as well be on the moon. And so what started to happen is I think the colonists actually forgot the reality of being British. And in a moment, I'll explain what did being British or being English, what was that like in 1763? And it turned out it was quite different from what the colonies' lives were like. In other words, the colonies are going to argue that England has changed, and that's why they need to break apart. But the reality is, it was the colonists that had changed. The colonists were American long before they realized it. And that may seem weird, but you may know people like this, people who are dating or married, and they're arguing all the time. They're constantly complaining. I have family members where they're always arguing. They never seem to like to be together. And everyone else is like, why don't they get divorced? But they don't know it. They just think it's normal. And then over time, they eventually realize, oh, I don't actually like this relationship. And they finally break up. People usually break up months, years, even decades, sometimes longer than they should have. And that's going to be the colonists in England. It's going to take the colonists about 13 years to realize that they in England aren't compatible anymore, and they're going to break up again, like a divorce. Taxes is not really the reason. Even representation is not really the reason. It's really they had become two different groups of people. They just took taxes and really were just a spark. It's like, again, if maybe you've been through a breakup or seen people going through a breakup, but they're arguing about dinner. They're arguing about who's taking the garbage out. But that's not really what they're arguing about. That's just a spark, that's really hinting at a much deeper problem. So real quick, this idea that again, it was all about taxes. It's really funny because when you really look at who were paying the taxes, people in Britain, or again, sorry, I guess I should say throughout out, England, were paying about 26 times what people in the colonies were paying. So 26 shillings, which is just a form of money, it's a fraction of what a pound was, 26 shillings to 1 shilling in the colonies. And yet we're the ones who rebelled, not them. So what was the pattern in the colonies like before 1763? So again, the British government had been ignoring the colonies, the very loose government. The colonies were kind of used to governing themselves. Colonists had widespread land ownership. Even though if you get into the legalities, the crown would still claim that they owned the colonies, blah, blah. But the reality is, for all intents and purposes, people mostly owned their own land. And remember, there was a land that they could go and get. People were landowners. And I write there slaves too. And even obviously today we would say that's a horrible thing, and of course it is, but slaves were power. Slaves were money. And, colonists were able to own slaves if they wanted to, legally. Not in England. The English Empire allowed it elsewhere, but not in England. So that's a freedom. I know that sounds funny to talk about freedom and slavery together, but that is a freedom that British colonists had that British people did not have, in the same way of land ownership. Hardly anybody owned their own land in England. And by the way, that still hasn't changed much. Even today, land ownership is still very small in England. But in the colonies, widespread. Colonies were able at the colonial level, at the Georgia level or the Virginia level, but even down at the county and town level, were able to run their own governments. That they voted, for their own representatives at the city level and at the colonial level, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, for instance. And within those legislative bodies could pass local laws and local ordinances and pass local taxes. That's not happening in Scotland or England at all. This is something there is some local government, city government stuff, but very few people have access to that government and have a say in that government. But in the colonies, widespread self-governance. And again, they're because they're not in England and Scotland, they don't see the king. They're not seeing that but national government. It's as though it doesn't exist to them. All they're used to is controlling themselves. Again, getting back to a marriage, just like, a husband that's just used to living on his own all the time and doing whatever he wants, and then coming back home and going, oh, I have a family that I have to negotiate with. I don't like this. So the colonies are used to a lot of freedom, is what I'm getting at here. And I've already said this, but most of them were not born in Britain. They didn't have any, very few had even been to Britain. One of the few of the founding fathers that had, of course, was Benjamin Franklin. He actually spent about 20 years in London. In fact, if you ever get a chance to go to London, you can visit his apartment there. But Jefferson, Adams, these huge figures, Alexander Hamilton, never been to Britain before the Revolution. But Adams and Jefferson later will go to Britain. In fact, when John Adams met with King George III in the 1780s, he actually broke down and cried. He was overwhelmed by emotion. And in fact, there's a lot of, by the way, not one monarch ever came to the colonies, ever. Which is kind of remarkable to think about that. And of course, that was for safety reasons. They worried about pirates sinking a ship, all kinds of reasons. But there's a lot of debate that had King George III come to the colonies, there probably would not have been a revolution. There would have been such an outpouring of support and just, Adams talks about this, that he was shocked that he was so overwhelmed when he actually met the monarch. So what I'm getting at is, they have kind of a skewed sense of what it even means to be British. In fact, during the Revolution, several people say exactly that. that you guys have forgotten what really being English is like. Samuel Johnson was a writer, a writer based in London. In fact, he's probably most famous for writing basically the first English language dictionary. And he did not like the colonists at all. He just thought we were a bunch of spoiled brats that just didn't want to pay their fair share of taxes. He's a tiny bit right. Not maybe the spoiled brat part, but we really weren't paying the taxes we were supposed to pay as English people. He was a little bit right there, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So what was being British like in 1763? In other words, living in England or living in Scotland, what was that actually like? Less than 5% actually owned land. Therefore, because you had to own at least 40 shillings worth of land to even be, and of course it had to be male, to vote. That means less than 5% of people in England or Scotland were able to vote. So when we talk about taxation without representation, which of course that means that this government is taxing you, but you don't have any say in that government. You're not represented in that government. Well, over 95% of all British people were not represented in their own government, and yet they didn't rebel, but we did. So that's interesting. They paid very, very high taxes over there. Basically, and this is still the case in 2020, being British means paying a lot of taxes. My wife and I more than once have talked about moving there, and who knows, when we retire, we might, because we do love it over there. And yet, we forget about that part, like, oh, wow. It is a lot of money, even to this day. Again, you could not have slaves there. There are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, you couldn't just go out and buy a slave, and just like you couldn't just go out and buy land. So for them, they saw the colonies as wild and ungoverned and free. So, like, for instance, when the colonists start to argue their case, and by the way, the colonists do have some strong arguments, as we'll get into, but still, people in England keep looking at each other like, what are you complaining about? You got it great compared to our lives here. So sometimes that is important to consider it from the other viewpoint as well. All right, so this is what the colonies look like basically before the revolution happened. So again, as you can see, the boundaries are a little bit different than what we're used to today. Although I will say, actually, by the time of the revolution, and it's not on this map, Florida also was a colony. People forget Florida was the 14th colony, and Canada, which is above this map, Canada would have been the 15th colony. We do sometimes forget that Canada and Florida were also part of the colonies. We tend to think of the main 13, of course. So one thing to keep in mind, these colonies, they didn't initially think of themselves as American or the colonists. Of course, they thought of themselves as English or British, but it's kind of like this class. Of course, all you're sitting at home, but if you were in the classroom, it would be no different. And that is, you don't necessarily think of yourself as a class. You think of yourself as just you, whoever you are, right? And so to you, it's a relationship between you and the professor. You don't really care you don't care that all your other students make an A or B or C. All you care about is what you make. And that's normal. That's normal. That's like these colonies. Georgia didn't care what was going on in New York. New York didn't care what was happening in Virginia. Virginia didn't care about Pennsylvania. It was the relationship between that colony and England. They were making money and sending money to England. That was their relationship. They did not have a sense of a unified group. But for instance, hopefully I haven't done this, but if I really, really screw up and treat you guys unfairly, even online, y'all might start communicating with each other. You might start banding together. And in fact, you might even eventually go to the president of the college and say, Dr. Nelson's a problem. We got to get rid of him. And at that point, I'm in trouble. So what will start to happen during this period is the colonies do begin to start to think of themselves as one unified group versus England. In other words, they're going to see themselves as having a common enemy. One thing that England is going to say to the colonies throughout this period is that the colonies had forgotten why they exist. And there's some truth to this. In other words, the reason colonies exist is not for freedom. Colonies were not founded for religious freedom, for instance. We tend to say that today. We look at the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and yes, there are certain individuals that came over for, not really religious freedom, but to because they really wanted a very specific type of religion. But that's actually very few colonists anyway. They were not coming over here for democracy. These are our ideas that were kind of putting on the colonists. Colonies existed for really one reason: to make money for the home country, England. That's why the colonies existed. The reason colonists came over, of course, is, often because they couldn't get a job, just like immigrations today. They couldn't get a job back home. They were maybe a part of a family where there's too many kids and there wasn't enough food on the table. But the colonies existed to make money for England. And this is how they made money: by raw goods like timber and cod, which of course is a fish, naval stores, that's basically anything to do with the building and maintenance of ships, pig iron, which is just kind of raw iron that would have been sent back to England in bricks, and then in England would have been melted down into tools and other machinery and such, sugar, tobacco, cotton, rice. This is why colonies exist. And of course, what England will say to the colonies is, if you don't like it, come back to England. No one's making you stay in the colonies, right? Not only that, but I have, where it says major cities. The reason I have that is just give you a sense of sort of the scale here. London had about 1 million people during the time of the Revolution. Glasgow, Scotland, Manchester, Bristol. These were cities that were 500,000 or close to 1 million people each. These were major cities. The biggest city we had was Philadelphia, 30,000. That's the biggest we had. Of course, to put that in perspective, of course, I know I keep forgetting a lot of you. I was about to say Bainbridge is about 10,000, but I forgot about 2/3 of you are not in Bainbridge. But again, a typical small town in Georgia is anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 people. Philadelphia had 30,000, that's it. Boston, 15,000, New York, 25,000, Baltimore, 5,000. In the South, Virginia and further south, the biggest city was Charlestown, later known just simply as Charleston, South Carolina, had 9,000 people. That's it. And what I'm trying to get at is, most of you are in Southwest Georgia. The big city is Atlanta. The capital of Georgia is Atlanta. It doesn't feel like Atlanta has any knowledge of what's going on in Southwest Georgia. We're podunk. That's the relationship of London to the colonies, right? And sometimes some of the colonies get the perception that England is almost coming after them. And for most of the time, they weren't. And I think the colonies really had no perception of the perspective of how big England was, how populated it was, how powerful it was compared to these really relatively podunk colonies. In other words, England was barely thinking of the colonies up until pretty late, actually. So you probably have seen this flag. People have seen it as bumper stickers and T-shirts and stuff. Join or die. And it was revived during the Revolution, but this actually came out in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1754. The assumption was that Benjamin Franklin probably designed it, and it was during the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. And this is kind of the first sign, if you will, the colonists were sort of uniting. In this particular case, not against England, but against the French and the Spanish, because it was, the French and Indian War, aka 7 Years' War, it was really sometimes seen as the First World War. It was a major war. And obviously it's the war that's going to send us into the revolution eventually. And so during that war, the colonists were saying, hey, look, we need to get over our differences and join together because we're fighting a major war. And in case you're wondering, obviously it's South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then just New England, which is several colonies together. But this is the first time colonists are starting to think of themselves as sort of a united group. The real sense of that won't happen for another 15 years or so. But this is, again, a little sign that they are thinking of themselves as one people instead of competing colonists. So the origins of the revolution, I mean, the deep origins, I think to understand why the colonists did what they did, we have to look way in the past. I mean, a lot of what they did is simply because they're British. Great Britain, Scotland, England, Wales has a deep history of rebelling. Maybe not quite in the same way we think of when we think of the American Revolution, but again, of rebelling, of rising up, if you will, against perceived corruption. And again, that word perceived is very much on purpose, because even during our revolution, we will accuse the British government of being highly corrupt and very oppressive and tyrannical. May not have been quite as bad as we said. But that perception, I mean, perception is reality. Just like if you're married and you think your spouse is cheating, well, the spouse might as well be cheating because you think they are. So perceived corruption and the uses of arbitrary power. And so what do I mean by arbitrary power? Basically random power. In face-to-face classes, I sometimes do a thing where I give this whole spiel about how to do better in your test, means you need to stand up and exercise. And I did used to have a teacher, I used to make us all stand up and stretch halfway through class. So I'm pretending, but I'll tell the students, I think we're going to get up and do jumping jacks every day in class. And I'll say, okay, let's do it. And maybe one student will actually stand up, but nobody else will. And I say, all right, never mind. Let's do a quiz instead. Take out a sheet of paper. And of course, everybody takes out a sheet of paper. And I ask, well, why did you do that? And they'll say, well, because we always do that. And I say, yes, but we don't always do jumping jacks, do we? No. And that's why none of you did the jumping jacks. In other words, that's my little demonstration of the jumping jacks just seem really weird and random and just out of nowhere, while taking out a sheet of paper to take a quiz was part of a pattern. It was normal. It was expected. That's what I mean by arbitrary power. It's not just power, but when it comes out of nowhere, when it just seems random, that's what I mean. And again, there's a deep history of this in Britain. So let's go back quite a ways. So King John. Now, most of you are probably like, I've never heard of King John. And by the way, this is not done during his lifetime. I don't think there is a painting of him during his lifetime. But some of you actually have heard of King John, if you've ever heard or watched a Robin Hood tale. Robin Hood, who probably didn't really exist, but it's an old folk tale. Obviously, Robin Hood was somebody that he was rich himself, and he robbed from other rich people because the poor were being abused. And the king during these stories was King John. So, for instance, back in the 90s, people who are Harry Potter fans might recognize Snape. Alan Rickman played King John in that version. When I hear King John, this is what I think of, the old 70s Disney version, although the best version's from the 30s. Errol Flynn, Robin Hood, and Claude Rains as King John. Now, usually this is where I'm supposed to say, yes, the movies always portray King John as a really bad guy, but in reality, he wasn't really that bad. Nope. In fact, actually, King John was much worse than his movie versions. He murdered a lot of people. He divorced one wife when she was too old, about 30, and married, depending on who you read, anywhere from 8-year-old to 12 years old. But he married a very, very, even for the time, a very young female, and consummated the marriage on their wedding night. So not a very good guy. And he didn't rule very well either. So again, if you know your Robin Hood, you may know that there's the good King Richard the Lionhearted was actually the king, and John was just simply his brother. And it is true, Richard went off to fight in the Crusades, although Richard wasn't a nice guy either, but he went off to fight in the Crusades. So King John was sort of the substitute king, but eventually Richard actually was killed, and so King John became the king himself. I'll leave it on here. We'll use Claude Rains as King John. So during King John's reign, he did a couple of things. First off, raise taxes through the roof. And back then, what raising taxes really meant was, again, most of the land was owned by a small group of lords or barons. They were the landowners. And so they would be the ones that pay the taxes to the king. But of course, they got their money by collecting taxes from the people who lived on their land. So the landowners, the lords, were not happy with King John at that point. Then King John started a war with France, and France was the power at this point, and it's a war they couldn't win. And the way you went to war was, I mean, the king did have his own army, but it wasn't that big, but he would go to the landowners and say, you need to build up some soldiers. So they would go to the people that lived on their land and say, okay, you're going to fight for me. So again, the war was on the backs of the landowners. Then he also made the Pope mad. This is back when England was still part of the Catholic Church. The Pope was essentially the king of the church. And so at that point, the Pope got mad and excommunicated England. And of course, it means no communication with the church, which basically means you are cut off from the church, which means you don't do confessions, you don't do last rites. And so what that really means is you're going to hell. That's what to be excommunication. You're damned to hell. So to review, England is paying high taxes. England is fighting a war it can't win. So they're dying. And when they do die, they're going to be all going to hell. So not surprising, the people of England, in other words, landowners and the people that lived on their land, decided to rise up against the king. And there was basically a war between the landowners and the king and his army. And it did not go well for John. And so at a place called Runnymede, which is, if you ever get a chance to go there, it's basically just a field. But at Runnymede, they signed essentially a peace treaty. It's not known as the Treaty of Runnymede, but that's basically what it was. King John basically gave in, because they had him surrounded, and he basically gave in to their demands. And then, by the way, once he signed it, he went back to London. He immediately reneged on it. He says, I'm not doing that. But fortunately for history, he died within the year, and his son became king. And he said, I will abide by that treaty because I want to be king. So if you ever get a chance to go to Runnymede, obviously it's in England, you'll see signs like this, the birthplace of modern democracy. You'll see monuments such as this one. This is the main monument there, which, by the way, was put up by the American Bar Association. American lawyers put this up. In fact, it always surprises people when they go there and realize the major monument is an American monument, because that treaty, if you will, that document really is kind of considered sort of the foundation of modern law in England and in America. So again, King John agreed to this, and he signed essentially what is known as a big document, the Magna Carta. That's literally what it means, big document, big piece of paper. And again, some of the monuments you see at Runnymede is, like this one, symbols of democracy, symbols of people participating in government, having a say in the government. So we have to be careful here. I think some people have exaggerated a little bit of the Magna Carta, but in 1215, this document was signed. And then again, the landowners and King John, it's a very odd document. If you ever get it, it's of course written in Latin, but if you read the translation, it talks about fishing at one point and all these weird things. It's very specific to 1215. I mean, there's 63 clauses, only 3 still matter today. One of these is about liberty of the church, that the king won't force the church to do things, that City of London and other cities do have some specific rights. But the one that everyone talks about is the idea of nobody shall be imprisoned without lawful judgment of their equals. And that's, it gets into habeas corpus. This is a quote, translated quote: no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled, nor will we proceed to with force against him except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. In other words, there is the rule of law is what we're talking about here. So why does the Magna Carta matter? This document from 1215. Why am I talking about this when I'm talking about the American Revolution? Um, because the implications of this document is huge, and it is part of the tradition of English law, and the founding fathers are making direct references to this. So what are some of the core aspects that are implied by this thing? One is this idea that no one's above the law. That's what I mean by a rule of law, as opposed to an arbitrary rule of just a person. Even the king has to obey the law. That was kind of incredible, and that was something that was very uniquely English. Um, you know, even the king was limited in his powers by this document. This is really kind of one of the earliest rebellions against arbitrary power. And again, the founding fathers would have seen what they were doing as a continuation of, in the same way today when we do things and we say, well, the founding fathers believe this. Well, the founding fathers were pointing back to 1215 and saying, look what our forefathers were doing. And I have to be careful with the next one. It is sort of the start of civil rights. And I mean literally the start of civil rights, that you do have certain rights of just because you're English. Now, again, the ideas of being a trial by a fair trial by a jury of your peers. You know, some of the other civil rights that we might think about won't come about, maybe even for centuries, but this is the start of it. This is the start of Parliament, because what these landowners were telling King John basically is, you can't start wars, you can't tax us unless we at least have some say in this. Now, over time, it takes a long time, but eventually what evolves is a parliament. Initially a House of Lords, again, the landowners, but eventually you also get a House of Commons, the representation of sort of regular people. And today we still have the House of Lords and House of Commons, but really the Commons is, they really do everything. And even our Congress, the Senate and House of Representatives, is sort of our version of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Not only that, but if you think about what the Congress does, they're the ones that tax. They're the ones that declare war. They control the purse strings. That's going back to Magna Carta. And finally, this, you know, obviously, you know, part of what they're debating with King John is the taxation. And so they're basically saying, you can't do this unless you talk to us first. Again, it's very minor at first, but over time that becomes more and more of the standard. So even when the colonists are debating with England over taxes, we always talk about King George III, but really it's Parliament that taxes, not the king. But that's the idea of the Magna Carta. This is from an Australian website, but there is a straight line from Magna Carta to things like Petition of Rights, a more strict habeas corpus act, going into the English Bill of Rights, finally the Declaration and the Constitution, but even get into modern documents today. And I think a lot of people are surprised that a lot of what we think of as sort of American values really were English values. They were already doing things like freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Maybe not as strong as we do them today, but these are not brand new ideas. Okay, let's jump a few hundred years ahead. So in Unit 1, you guys learned about, through your readings, you learned about, you know, colonization of the New World. And of course, the first permanent colony with Jamestown, named for King James I. So let's pick it up with King Charles. So King James I of England, James Tudor, that's the last name, he was a successful king, and he died in 1625. And his son, Charles, becomes then King of England. Charles was a nice guy. He was not a cruel ruler, but he was not the smartest monarch in British history. His father actually wrote him a book about how to be king. As far as we can tell, Charles never read it. So Charles makes some major mistakes, and he doesn't call Parliament into session for about 15 years. That's a problem because Parliament's going to get angry. He raises, there is a theme here. He raises taxes. He also starts messing with the church. He starts changing the Church of England. And he's really trying to have a little more control over it, but it's perceived that he is turning the church more and more Catholic. And so what starts to happen in both Scotland and England is that we see people beginning to rise up against King Charles. It starts in a church, actually, in Edinburgh, Scotland. Somebody literally gets mad because he has changed the services, and there is a riot in Edinburgh, Scotland. We see it. We see other riots throughout England and Scotland. Finally, Parliament gets angry. And what it eventually evolves into is what sometimes is known as the English Civil War. But actually, it was a war that was Ireland, Scotland, and England. Sometimes it's known as the War of Three Kingdoms. What ultimately happens is eventually King Charles is captured by the Scottish army, who then turns him over to the English army, who then bring him to Parliament. And in Parliament in London, King Charles is put on trial for violating the rights of English and Scottish people. I mean, this is just unbelievable. I mean, a king is being imprisoned and put on trial by his own subjects. During that, King Charles is really kind of a sad person. At one point, when he's in prison, by the way, he's literally held in a castle. He tries to escape twice. One time he escaped with some help, and he got out, he got on a horse and rode off, but the horse had a heart attack and died. And so the English army caught with him. And then another time, it's like a bad movie. They snuck in a tool for him to basically file down the bars and climb out the window. And he tries to do that, and he actually got stuck in the window. And the next day when they brought him breakfast, he's literally hanging out the window. Pretty sad case. During the trial in Parliament, there's this really kind of infamous moment. King Charles is talking to somebody. He's got a walking cane, and it slips out of his fingers. So he puts his hand out basically to say, someone's going to hand me this. When you're king, you just put your hand out. People put things in it, right? And he stands there, and then he realizes no one is picking up his cane. And eventually he has to lean over and pick the cane up himself. And in a weird way, at that moment, Charles really was no longer king. I mean, eventually they find him guilty of violating the rights of the people and violating the rights of Parliament. And not only do they, sorry, I thought that wasn't the slide I was looking for. Not only do they put him on trial, but they execute him. They chop his head off. They kill the king. And actually, for the next decade and a half, Britain, England, Wales, Scotland, doesn't have a king at all. They become a commonwealth. And again, this is quite radical. The leader of all of this was a guy named Oliver Cromwell. That's the person you see here, later known as the King Killer. Here is Oliver Cromwell looking upon the body of King Charles. And you may go, wait a minute, I thought you said he cut his head off. Because he was king, they did sew the head back onto the body. And so England and Scotland was ruled as a commonwealth. Now, essentially, Oliver Cromwell really was basically a king. He was almost a dictator. But officially, they did not have a monarchy. This was a Puritan government, by the way. So they got rid of theaters and pubs, most holidays. They basically ruled very harshly. And fairly quickly, people in Britain ended up not liking this. So after Oliver Cromwell died, his son became the main ruler. And people were basically saying, wait a minute, this is just a monarchy. So eventually, Cromwell's were overthrown, and the monarchy, the official monarchy, was restored. It's known as the Restoration. So Charles is dead, but he does have several sons, and they're over in France hiding out. So his oldest son was also named Charles. So he is restored to Scotland and then eventually restored to England, and he becomes King Charles II. So this period is known as the Restoration. He ruled again for the next basically 25 years. His father, King Charles I, one of the suspicions of his father was that the people in England and Scotland thought that maybe he was really Catholic. Turns out he wasn't. But his son, Charles II, was Catholic. Now, he kept it quiet, but he was actually Catholic. And he was married to a Catholic woman. Before he died, he took last rites. So again, the irony, they killed his father for suspicion of him being maybe a Catholic. That's not the only reason, but one of the reasons. And yet they bring back and celebrate his son, who was a Catholic. Anyway, one of the first things that Charles does is he has Oliver Cromwell's body dug up and chops his head off. And by the way, on the left here, that is what's known as a death mask. It was very common for people when they died that they would make a cast molding of their face so people would remember, because remember, no photographs. By the way, so he took the head and then made sure he had it mounted on the London Bridge. And it stayed there for about 40 years. I mean, people kind of forgot about it. And eventually somebody took it down. And to this day, it is kept at the University College of London. And for years and years and years, history professors, when they talked about this period, they would literally bring his head in. You can still Google it. You can Google Oliver Cromwell's head, and you can see pictures of his mummified head on the stake. Anyway. Oh, by the way, the other thing that King Charles did is he went after anybody else that had anything to do with his father's death and had them all executed. So King Charles II is, again, even though he was really Catholic deep down, people liked him, and but he was married, but all his natural born children died. If you may have noticed, disease has played a pretty big role in this class, and in many ways, disease created the United States, and specifically smallpox. And this is a good example. So King Charles II had smallpox, survived it, but all his children died, many of them from smallpox. Much of his family died of smallpox. But people really liked his brother, his young brother, Henry, who would eventually become Henry IX. And he was a good, devout Protestant, and people were really excited about him. It's kind of like William and Kate today. People really like them. They're ready for them to be king and queen. So that people were ready for Henry IX. And you might be going, I never heard of Henry IX. You're right. Because Henry Stuart died at a young age of smallpox, even before King Charles II died. So when King Charles II did die in 1685, the next king is the other brother, also called James. The problem with King James II, I mean, in many ways, he was very smart. The colonists, he was in charge of the colonists for a while. The colonists actually liked him in the 1600s. But King James was openly Catholic. And I know that seems so weird to say, but again, keep in mind, England was vehemently Protestant during this period. He was openly Catholic. He was married. His wife died, smallpox. His sons died, smallpox. He did have two daughters, Anne and Mary, and they were Protestant living in Europe. And so when he became king, people were not happy. They thought, oh, this guy's Catholic, but he doesn't have any sons, so that's okay. And you know, when he dies, he's old at this point. He won't be around long. When he dies, one of his daughters will become queen, and they're Protestants, and we'll be fine. Then while he's king, he marries a Spanish woman, Catholic, Spanish and Catholic. And then she gets pregnant and gives birth to a son, which means now that son will be the king of England when he dies. And that son is being raised Catholic. And at that point, people in England and Scotland got very, very nervous. We are now about to become a Catholic country again. who knows, we might become French or Spanish. But there was a real sense of panic because King James II was king, and it seems like his dynasty is going to continue. But again, he does have a daughter, Mary Stuart. She is Protestant. She is in Scandinavia. She is married to a king named William. And so there is a plan attached to, wait a minute, why don't we bring William and Mary from Holland and bring them to England, and they can become king and queen of England. We'll just get rid of King James II. This is known as the Glorious Revolution. Sometimes it's called the Bloodless Revolution because there was no bloodshed, which is totally untrue. Thousands of people died because it actually sparked major wars in Scotland and Ireland. So this is what happened. There were leaders, rulers, government people, landowners, intellectuals, all got together in 1688, and they said, look, we can do this. We can just, we're not going to kill the king. We're not going to do that again. But we can, because he has violated, this is what they argue, he has violated his contract with us because he is Catholic, and he's supposed to be Protestant. So the argument is we're just going to push him aside, and we'll just bring William and Mary in, and they will become king and queen. It's not quite that easy. William and Mary do show up. I mean, they're invited, and they show up with about 20,000 soldiers, by the way. I mean, this is really a coup d'etat. King James tried to hang on. He did have some supporters, but eventually he stormed off. He escaped. For instance, he took the Great Seal of England and threw it in the Thames River, and he escaped to France. And actually, he does try to come back a couple of times, and we call it the Jacobite rebellions, but it doesn't work. And so we get William and Mary. And it's funny because we always talk about them as one name, William and Mary. And of course, Williamsburg is named for King William, and William and Mary University in Virginia today is still around. But they rule. And by the way, Mary eventually dies of smallpox. She dies before he does. They do have some kids, but they die of smallpox. William, he gets smallpox, but he does survive it. But when she dies and then he dies, again, there's no children to pass it on to. But James did have one other daughter, Anne. Now, Anne had been married, but the husband died. She did have a son, but he dies. Both of them, by the way, died of smallpox. And so she survives until 1714, when she eventually dies of old age. And that's it. You know, this is the Stuart family. You know, you had the Tudors, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and now you have the Stuarts, King James, King Charles, Charles II, James II, William and Mary, and now Anne. Now the entire Stuart family is dead. Smallpox, old age, and one decapitation. Who is going to be king or queen of England and Scotland at this point? And so suddenly people are looking around, and there is another family, the Hanovers in Germany, and they are related to, to all of them. And they're basically cousins. So when Queen Anne dies in 1714, King George, basically from what is today Germany, is brought in and becomes King George I of England. He was basically German. He didn't even speak English. He came over, he was crowned, and almost immediately went back. 1714 is about the period where the colonies were starting to be ignored in a big way. And again, this is partly why, because you have what is essentially a German king who really doesn't care much about England and really doesn't care a lot about the colonies. So this is when the colonies start to get a lot of freedom. He is followed by his son, King George II. Now, King George II at least spoke English. He did live in England. He was more involved in England, but even he took a more aloof view. And it would be his grandson, another George, King George III, who will become king, and he will take a very different approach. he will be the change in pattern because he starts to pay attention to the colonies. And that's going to be a problem, as we'll see in a moment. So what I was trying to set up there in a weird way was looking at smallpox a little bit. You know, smallpox is one of the major diseases that wiped out many Native Americans. It also created the situation that led to all this royalty. I mean, you know, in other words, had smallpox not wiped out the Stuarts, we never would have gotten to Hanovers. And if we hadn't gotten to Hanovers, would we have had a revolution? And the answer very well, maybe no. Also, one last thing, during the revolution, there was a major smallpox epidemic that broke out. And there was this idea of inoculation. Inoculation is basically you give yourself the disease itself, and hopefully you don't die from it, and then you're immune to it. There was an inoculation for smallpox. It was very dangerous, but it was out there. The American Army under George Washington, Washington had the U.S. Army inoculated. The British Army did not inoculate themselves, and they actually lost thousands of soldiers to it. Had we not done that, we probably wouldn't have won the revolution. It's not the only reason we win, but it is a factor. So again, it's interesting how this one disease, smallpox, weaves its way through. But for us, the important part there was the Hanovers come in. Okay, so what are some of the other origins of the revolution beyond rebellion against arbitrary power? And again, you notice it was rebellion against King Charles I, and then rebellion against King James II. And to put that in perspective real quick, sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead here. When you think of the American Revolution, you know, we think it's this amazing thing that just happened out of nowhere. It actually was a part of a long pattern, as we can see. I mean, good Lord, in the 1600s, England gets rid of 2 kings. So what we did was kind of small potatoes. All we did was just divorce ourselves from the king. Okay, so what's another origin of the revolution? Now, we have talked about the Protestant Reformation in the past from a religious viewpoint and as one of the sparks that led people to come to the New World. But let's think about it in the longer range. One of the arguments during the Protestant Reformation between Catholics and the emerging Protestants is interpretations of the Bible and languages the Bible should be in. So one of the things that Protestants argued is that the Bible should be in our language, whoever we are, it should be in our language. And you and me, should read it for ourselves, and instead of having somebody tell us what it means. And so the impact of that outside of religion is that throughout Europe, and especially in Britain, we see increased literacy. Catholics and Protestants, by the way, increased literacy. And as you read more, you start thinking for yourself. I mean, you know, that's just one of the key ideas of reading and learning, is that you start to come up with your own ideas. So you get independent thinking. And some of the independent thinking is going to lead to the scientific revolution, but it's also going to lead to political advances. This is key to understanding, you know, why the American Revolution happened and why it happened when it happened. Another thing that we see a legacy of the Protestant Reformation is this idea of rising up against authority. I mean, rising up against the church. You know, that is the ultimate authority. And so not only are English people rising up against arbitrary power, they are very proud that they rose up against the Catholic Church. So again, this idea of rising up against authority, challenging authority, is an old English tradition that the colonists and the founding fathers are just going to have almost instinctively. But that scientific revolution, again, people like James Watt, I'm prone to Scotland, so obviously I'm picking a Scottish person, you know, a guy who revolutionized steam power that basically led to the Industrial Revolution. We see all kinds of scientific advancements in the 1700s. But we could also see kind of that same thing being applied to society, the Enlightenment. And in studying the Enlightenment today, I think there's a lot of negativity towards the Enlightenment. I know a lot of churches kind of sometimes look down on the Enlightenment. I know I've even spoken to some of the students in this class, and I know there's a lot of aggravation about the Enlightenment. So people see the Enlightenment as the beginning of a lot of problems we have today. And I think, I don't agree with that historically. And I think the Enlightenment is really key to understanding the United States. Without the Enlightenment, there is no U.S. I mean, U.S. is the ultimate product of the Enlightenment. The name itself is a little bit I mean, the people at that time, the intellectuals of that time, they came up with that term. The idea that they were enlightened. This is when we start using terms like the Dark Ages. People before us were in the Dark Ages. It is a bit of an arrogant term. But there are some key features that emerge in Europe, especially in England at this time, that's without which you can't imagine the United States. So again, it's the idea of some of these advancements in literacy and science now being applied to government and to society. So there's really kind of two essential features of the Enlightenment, if you will. One is just this core idea of just thinking for yourself. I'm not going to say people before the 1700s never thought for themselves, but this becomes a core value. This idea that you want, like in science, you want proof for why things are the way they are. And this idea of ending just pure superstition. Some people take this as like an anti-religious viewpoint. And some Enlightenment thinkers were anti-religious, but most were not. But what I mean by superstition in this case is, for instance, a monarchy. Why are you king? Oh, because your dad was king? So why does that make you a king? What makes you any better just because, you know, that's a superstitious, that's almost magical thinking, if you will. In other words, maybe the leader, for instance, should be somebody that shows evidence that they can think well. I mean, here it is, 2020. That's supposed to be what's happening now, right? We're supposed to be choosing the best person to be president. I'm not saying we're always doing that, but that's what I don't really think our elections campaigns achieve that goal, but that's supposed to be what's happening, right? So this idea, I mean, you can see how modern democracy emerges from this idea of let's choose the person that shows evidence of having the best qualities for what we want, instead of superstitiously just choosing somebody because they have the same blood as the current king, you know. And of course, thinking for yourself leads to ideas of reading, of freedom of the press and stuff. Then of course, the number two is tolerance of new or different ideas. Doesn't mean you agree with them, but you're not going to have somebody executed simply because they don't have the same viewpoint as you do. And again, that leads directly to freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. You can't have that unless you're going to tolerate, you're going to, you know, agree that we can have different beliefs in a society. You know, these are ideas, even before the American Revolution, these are ideas that are already finding currency. And again, not just in England, we're seeing this popping up in a lot of places in Europe at this point. So when we talk about all men are created equal, we talk about freedom of speech and the Constitution, these are Enlightenment documents. They wouldn't have been written 300 years earlier. You know, so all of these things have to be in place to get to the American Revolution. Of course, one of the founders, if you will, of the Enlightenment is John Locke. John Locke is writing during the Glorious Revolution. He is one of the guys actually involved in that. And so what again, I'm really simplifying here, and I'm really just talking about just one piece of some of his writings, but he does write about government at one point. And what he's really doing is, after the Glorious Revolution, because really what they did, they weren't supposed to do. I mean, King James was the legitimate king, and they just got rid of him. And so after the fact, they have to explain, like, why was that okay to do? And so John Locke explains, he's like, oh, it was okay, here's why. So what he basically argues, and other writers like Voltaire and Rousseau and others are going to pick up these ideas, and this is a very common idea today, but what John Locke says essentially is humans naturally want to be free and independent, right? We don't really want government. Because if you think about it, government is an encroachment of our freedom. I mean, government tells you what you can't do, government taxes you. We don't really want that. But at some point, as we develop, you know, we acquire property, houses, land, stuff, crops, whatever, we do need protection for that, you know, because there are other peoples out there that might come, like say other countries that might come and invade us and take our stuff. So we do need things like maybe an army. We do need a government. We do need laws. not too much. So we humans are willing to give up property, a little bit of property, in exchange for protection for the rest of our property. What I mean by giving up property, primarily I do mean taxes. We're willing to pay some taxes in exchange for services or protection. But we also mean ourselves as well. You know, we might be willing to be drafted or serve in an army, right? And so eventually we do develop governments. And so if you think about what a government is, it's, as Lockwood explained, it's basically a contract, you know, between us, the ruled, and the government itself, the rulers, right? And so we have responsibilities and the government has responsibilities. So we know what we have to do. We have to obey the laws, we have to pay taxes, right? And we know what happens if we break that contract. We get fined, we get punished. Back then we might have been whipped, might even be executed. So none of that was new. What makes John Locke so revolutionary is the other aspect to this. He says, well, what happens if the government, in his case, he's talking the king, but what happens if the government doesn't maintain their end of the bargain? Now what happens? And he says, well, we have the right as citizens to change that government. Now, in this case, he's talking about getting rid of King James II and bringing in William and Mary. That's all he's really talking about. But these are the core ideas of the Founding Fathers. In fact, if you were to take the Declaration of Independence and run it through turnitin.com, it will come up plagiarized because so many of those ideas are coming directly out of John Locke. I mean, they acknowledged it. They weren't hiding that. But John Locke basically gives the core argument of the American Revolution. Colonists are arguing that their rights are being violated by the government of England. Therefore, they have a right to break that contract and form their own government. I mean, so again, to get to the American Revolution, we have to have the ideas of John Locke there. Finally, I think the last piece of the puzzle, if you will, for the American Revolution is King George III, which if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's basically addressed to King George III as saying, you have done all these things. And it's interesting because I think Americans have kind of, you know, we kind of have this impression that King George III was a tyrant. He was a dictator. He was a horrible person. And it is ironic because King George III really wasn't those things. He was, first off, he was very popular when he was a young guy. He comes in, both England and the colonies were real excited because they thought finally a king that actually was going to pay attention and be involved. So he was really popular with everyone at first. He was considered an Enlightenment thinker. He was considered an intellectual in many ways. His nickname was Farmer George because unlike his grandfather and great-grandfather, he was born in England. He spoke English. He was as English as they come. He loved England. And again, he was called Farmer George because he loved agriculture. He would often ride off by himself. He wasn't supposed to, but he'd ride off by himself and hang out with farmers. And he'd, you know, get his hands right in the manure and mix it to make soil. And I mean, this guy, you know, was beloved by the people of England. And again, colonists, what they heard about him, they liked as well. And one of his legacies, if you forget the American Revolution for a moment, one of his legacies in England is the British Library, you know, sort of like our Library of Congress. The British Library, if you ever get a chance to go, it's amazing. Not only is it a great place to do research, but just as a tourist, you can go. They have this. They have the Magna Carta there. They have 2 copies of the Magna Carta, by the way, so you can actually see it. But they have, of course, you know, Dickens and Shakespeare and Lewis Carroll, you know, the original manuscripts and Jane Austen. You can go and see lyrics by the Beatles. I mean, it's just a J.K. Rowling's text for Harry Potter. All are on display. But one of the greatest collections of books anywhere in the world. And the British Library basically began as King George III's private library. And when you go to the British Library today, in the center is this huge glass enclosed room. And those are the actual books of King George III. Those are his private books. And that was, again, the beginning of the British Library. So one thing that King George III does when he comes in is he addresses the colonists themselves, and he says, look, we can do better. And by the way, what he says is absolutely right. He says, he is saying to the colonists, early on, he says, guys, to be honest with you, you guys really haven't been paying your fair share of taxes. You're really just paying a fraction of what you should be paying. And he's absolutely right about that. I mean, by English law, they should have been paying more. And he says, we do need to manage you guys a little bit more. We've been kind of letting you guys do your own thing. But at the same time, he really is trying to genuinely improve the colonies and hopefully make everybody richer. I mean, that is his ultimate goal. But he is the change in the pattern. This is the husband coming home late from work at night. So even though it wasn't his intention, it is the result. And so I do think King George III, I do think gets a bit of a bad rap historically. But he does still bear the blame, just like the made-up husband in my story. I don't think he's a bad guy, but he should have communicated better with his spouse. King George III, as we will see, could have communicated better. All right, so I've gone quite a bit on this. I know I'm hitting your attention span. So let me go ahead and stop here. This will be part 1. We'll actually do this in 3 parts instead of 2. So we'll stop with this one for now. We've gotten the background. When we come back, we'll pick up with the beginnings of the problems. What is that actual change in the pattern that King George III does? And we'll get into that next time. All righty. So let me very awkwardly turn this off, and I'll see you in part 2.